My son, my only child, looked at me with cold eyes and told me to get out of his life. He said I should take my husband's old junk and go rot away at that worthless ranch. He was about to have the meeting of a lifetime with a powerful investor, and he couldn't have his blue-collar mechanic's family ruining his image. He thought he was giving me a prison. What he didn't know was that he had just handed me the key, a key to a secret locked away in our dusty old barn, a secret that was about to make his entire world come crashing down. Stick with me to see how this story unfolds, and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I love seeing how far my story travels. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. The air in the lawyer's office was stale, smelling of old paper and grief that had long since dried up. I sat on the edge of a stiff leather chair, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. 3 days after burying my husband Robert, I was now here to witness the burial of my own life. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, droned on in a flat voice that was designed to sand the edges off of life and death. He finally got to the part that mattered. The main house in the city, the home where I'd raised my son, was to go to Marcus, to me, Eleanor, his 68-year-old mother. Robert had left the old ranch property and, as the will stated, all of its contents. Marcus didn't even let the man finish. He shifted in his chair, a smug look on his face, and said that was good enough. He then had the nerve to explain his reasoning. Right there in front of the lawyer, he spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime meeting with a powerful investor, a Mr. Harrison. He said, his voice laced with contempt, that he couldn't have Mr. Harrison digging around and finding out he came from a blue-collar mechanic's family. He said those exact words. It would ruin everything, he claimed. So I was to take Dad's pile of junk, as he called it, and just disappear to the ranch. I needed to stay out of his life. Every word was a hammer blow. This was my son, the boy I'd walked to school, the one I'd stayed up with all night when he had a fever. I had worked double shifts at the hospital for years to make sure he had a better life than we did, to make sure he never had to worry. And now he was ashamed of us, ashamed of his own father, ashamed of the very work that had put food on his table. I felt myself shrinking in that leather chair, becoming invisible. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was just an inconvenient piece of his past that needed to be swept away. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hollow space where my heart used to be. I looked at my son, my only child, one last time. He wouldn't meet my gaze. His eyes were already fixed on the future, a shiny, successful future that he was building, a future that had no room for me. The hours it took to pack up 40 years of a life were a silent, lonely blur. Marcus never showed up. He didn't offer to lift a single box or say a final goodbye. His car was gone when I started, and it was still gone when I locked the door to my own home for the last time. He had made his wishes clear. He wanted me erased, and he was efficient about it. The drive to the ranch was the longest 40 miles of my life. In my rearview mirror, the warm glow of the city, my city, began to shrink until it was just another distant star in the twilight sky. That house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was the place I'd measured Marcus's height on the doorframe. It was where I'd sat at the kitchen table, helping him with homework, my own dreams packed away in boxes year after year. Every sacrifice I had ever made felt like another mile marker on this road to nowhere, each one a silent testament to a love that had been thrown back in my face like loose change. The paved road gave way to a dirt track that hadn't seen a grader in years. My old sedan protested with every bump and rut, the car itself seeming to resist this final journey into isolation. When the farmhouse finally came into view, it sagged under the weight of its own loneliness. The paint was a ghost of what it once was, peeling away like sunburnt skin. The porch tilted at a sad angle, and the yard was choked with weeds that had long ago won their war against whatever garden had once been there. This wasn't a home. It was a gravestone for forgotten things. The key was under a loose stone on the bottom step, just where Robert had always kept it. The door groaned open into a cloud of musty air. Inside, the last of the evening light struggled through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom. The furniture was draped in white sheets, silent, shapeless figures guarding a tomb. Each footstep I took on the creaking floorboards echoed in the vast emptiness, a stark reminder of my solitude. But the silence was the loudest thing in the house. It wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on me from all sides. I sank into an old armchair, the dust puffing up around me like a final sigh. This was it. This was my reward for a lifetime of devotion and exile. In that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that wasn't mine, I felt a despair so profound it felt like the end of the world. The woman I used to be, Robert's wife, Marcus's mother, she hadn't just left the city. She had ceased to exist altogether. I don't know how long I sat there, in the darkness, wrapped in the cold silence of the farmhouse. Hours, maybe. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. The tears finally came. Not the quiet, dignified ones I'd shed at Robert's funeral, but ragged, desperate sobs that tore through me. They were tears for my husband, for the future we were supposed to have together. They were tears for the son I had lost, not to death, but to something far crueler, ambition, shame. I wept until my throat was raw and my body ached with a hollow emptiness that was deeper than any grief I had ever known. When there were no tears left, a fragile calm settled over me. My gaze fell upon this dusty mantelpiece, where a single photograph had been left behind. It was an old, faded picture of Robert and me, taken not long after we were married. He was in his work clothes, a smudge of grease on his cheek, but his smile was the brightest thing in the frame. He was looking at me, his eyes full of a quiet, steady love that had been my anchor for 40 years. Looking at his face, I remembered something. Robert was never a man of grand gestures or eloquent words. His love was in his actions. It was in the way he'd fix the leaky faucet without me ever having to ask, the way he'd start my car on cold mornings, the way he'd patiently build every piece of furniture Marcus ever needed for his school projects. He was a builder, a fixer. He had spent his entire life creating and repairing, taking what was broken and making it whole again. And in that moment, I realized what my son, Marcus, truly was. He was a destroyer. He hadn't just broken my heart. He had taken a sledgehammer to the very foundation of our family, shattering everything Robert had worked so hard to build. A new feeling began to stir in the pit of my stomach, pushing aside the cold despair. It was anger, a clean, hot anger that burned away the last of my tears. It wasn't a wild, reckless rage. It was focused. It was the anger of a woman who had been pushed too far, a woman who had nothing left to lose. I was angry at Marcus for his cruelty, for his weakness, but I was also angry at myself, angry for being so soft for so long, angry for letting his ambition blind me to the man he was becoming, angry for believing my love would be enough to keep him decent. I stood up from the armchair, my back straight for the first time in days. The house was no longer a prison. It was a fortress. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was strategic. I walked over to the photograph, picked it up, and wiped the dust from the glass with the sleeve of my sweater. I looked at Robert's smiling face and made a silent vow. Robert, I promised him in my mind, I will not let it end like this. I will not let our son erase the memory of the good man you were. I will not let him trample on your legacy. My grief had been a fog, but now it had crystallized into a diamond-hard purpose. I didn't know how, and I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I wouldn't just survive in this place. I would fight back. I would take this worthless ranch, this pile of junk that my son had thrown me into, and I would find a way to turn it into a weapon. The next morning, I woke, not to the familiar sounds of the city, but to a silence that was different from the night before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with purpose. My purpose, my promise to Robert echoed in my mind, a clear note in the quiet air. I wouldn't find my weapon sitting in the dusty farmhouse. I knew where I had to look. the place my son had so contemptuously called a pile of junk. The barn, the large barn, stood at the edge of the property, its red paint faded to a dull, weary rose. The doors were heavy, and they protested with a long, drawn-out groan as I pulled them open. Disturbing years of settled dust. Sunlight streamed in through the gaps in the walls, cutting bright stripes through the thick, hazy air. The place smelled of old oil, cold metal, and forgotten time. And it was exactly as Marcus had described it. A graveyard of metal. Old engine parts were piled in corners. Rusted tools hung from the walls like strange, metallic skeletons. Shelves overflowed with nuts, bolts, and canisters of fluids I couldn't identify. To my untrained eye, it was chaos. It was the mess of a man's lifelong obsession, a language I had never tried to learn. For years, I had seen this place as Robert's escape, a retreat from the world, and sometimes a retreat from me. Now, I saw it for what it was, his sanctuary. My mission was simple. I had to clean. I had to organize. I needed to impose order on this chaos, partly to keep my mind from spiraling back into grief, but mostly because I felt a desperate need to understand the man I was married to for 40 years. I started with a corner, sweeping away thick blankets of dust and cobwebs that felt like they had been there since the beginning of time. It was hard, physical work, the kind my body wasn't used to anymore. But with every stroke of the broom, with every box I moved, I felt a small piece of my power returning. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the barn into a sweltering oven. Sweat trickled down my back, but I didn't stop. I was driven by a force I couldn't name. And then I saw it. In the far back corner, mostly hidden behind a stack of old tires and rusted fenders, was a large object covered by a heavy, gray canvas tarp. It was bigger than a workbench, more substantial than a pile of parts. It had a definite shape. My heart began to beat a little faster. I had seen this tarp here on my few visits over the years, but I'd always assumed it was just more of Robert's clutter. Now, it felt different. It felt important. I walked over to it, my boots crunching on the dusty floor. I reached out, and my fingers brushed against the rough, weathered canvas. It felt like I was about to uncover an ancient artifact. I took a deep breath, grabbed a corner of the tarp, and pulled. It was heavy, stiff with age, but as it slid away, it revealed something that made me gasp. It wasn't junk. It wasn't a pile of parts. It was the smooth, elegant curve of a car body, painted a deep, impossible sapphire blue that seemed to drink the light, even under a thick layer of dust. The color was so vibrant, so alive. It felt like it had a heartbeat. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a gasp. The sapphire blue of the car was hypnotic. I walked around it slowly, my boots leaving a trail in the thick dust. It was beautiful, but it was also incomplete. The chrome trim was missing in places. One headlight sat loosely in its socket, and the tires were flat and cracked with age. It was a work in progress, a magnificent skeleton waiting for its final pieces. This was Robert's secret. This was what he had been working on all those weekends, all those late nights he'd spent out here in the barn. I reached out and gently opened the driver's side door. It swung open with a well-oiled, satisfying click, a sound that spoke of careful, loving maintenance. The interior was a stark contrast to the dusty exterior. The black leather seats were immaculate, supple and clean, as if they were brand new. The dashboard gleamed, a symphony of chrome dials and gauges that I didn't understand. It smelled of old leather and something else, something that was just Robert, his quiet dedication, his patient hands. This wasn't just a car. It was a cathedral he had built to his passion. My eyes fell on a small, leather-bound book resting on the passenger seat. It looked out of place in this world of metal and grease. I picked it up. The leather was worn smooth with use. It wasn't a manual or a technical guide. It was a journal, Robert's journal. My hands trembled as I opened it to the first page. His familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages. A script I knew as well as my own. For the next hour, I sat in the driver's seat of that beautiful, unfinished car and read my husband's secret history. The journal spanned 20 years. It started with the discovery of the car's rusted frame in a farmer's field 3 towns over. Robert had bought it for next to nothing. He wrote about the painstaking process of identifying it, the thrill he felt when he realized what he had found. He chronicled every step of the restoration, every bolt he tightened, every piece he sourced from obscure collectors across the country. He wrote of his frustrations when a part didn't fit, and his quiet triumphs when a piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. This wasn't just a logbook. It was a love story. Robert had poured his heart into this car, his words filled with the passion I had only seen glimpses of in our life together. He wrote about the elegant lines of the body, the genius of the engine design, the soul he believed every great machine possessed. I was reading the private thoughts of the man I thought I knew, and realizing there were entire universes inside him I had never explored. Then, near the end of the journal, I found the entry that changed everything. My breath caught in my throat as I read the words. He had written about a phone call, about a man who had seen the preliminary designs for the restoration. He had written a name, Harrison, and then a single, stunning sentence. Harrison saw the blueprints. He called it the Holy Grail. When it's done, call him first. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the leather seat. Harrison. The name echoed in my mind, the same name my son had spoken with such reverence. The investor, the man Marcus was so desperate to impress, the man he was willing to disown his own family for. A cold, electric feeling shot through me. It wasn't just hope anymore. It was certainty. This beautiful, blue car wasn't just a pile of junk. It wasn't just a passion project. It was a key, and I was beginning to think I knew exactly which door it was meant to unlock. I sat at the worn kitchen table for a long time, Robert's journal open in front of me. The name Harrison seemed to be burned into the page. A connection so direct, so improbable. It felt like a trap, but it also felt like destiny. My mind, which had been a fog of grief and anger, was now starting to clear. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity. Hope was a dangerous thing, but this felt like more than hope. It felt like a path opening up in front of me. I needed to know if it was real. I needed confirmation. There was only one person I could call, an old friend of Robert's from his car club, a man named Arthur Pence. He was a retired mechanic himself, a man who spoke the same language of engines and chrome that Robert had. I found his number in Robert's old address book. The paper yellowed with age. My fingers felt clumsy as I dialed the number on the old rotary phone that hung on the kitchen wall. It felt like I was calling a different lifetime. Arthur answered on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar. I kept my own voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. I told him I was at the ranch, cleaning out the barn. I told him I had found Robert's project car. I described the sapphire blue body, the unfinished state. Then I told him about the journal. I read him the entry where Robert identified the car, a Shelby Cobra, 1966. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for so long, I thought the connection had been lost. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice was a choked whisper. "Eleanor," he said. "Say that again." I repeated the words, my own voice a monotone. "A Shelby Cobra, 1966. I heard him take a sharp, ragged breath. He told me, his voice filled with a reverence I had never heard from him before, that what I was describing was not just a car. It was a legend, a holy grail for collectors, a true barn find of that model, in any condition, was the stuff of dreams. My hand tightened on the receiver. I then told him the second part. I told him about the note mentioning a man named Harrison. Another silence, this one even more profound than the last. He told me that if James Harrison, the billionaire investor and collector, was interested, then the car wasn't just a dream. It was a winning lottery ticket. He said it could be worth millions, not 1 million, millions. Plural. The floor seemed to drop out from under me, but I held on. I steered the conversation away from the money. I started asking questions. I wanted to know about this Mr. Harrison. I asked Arthur what kind of man he was. Arthur told me Harrison was a purist. He didn't care about flashy new things. He cared about history, about craftsmanship, about the story behind the machine. He respected legacy. As Arthur talked, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My mind was racing, connecting dots I hadn't even known existed. When I hung up the phone, I was a different woman. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was no longer a discarded mother. The shock was gone. The hope was gone. The fear was gone. They had all been burned away and forged into something new, something hard and unbreakable. I was the keeper of a legend, the inheritor of a legacy. And now I held a weapon worth millions. The best part was, my son had no idea. He had just handed it to me. The next 2 days were a blur of focused activity. The conversation with Arthur had lit a fire under me, transforming my grief into pure, cold strategy. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for war. The first step was to leave the isolation of the ranch. I drove into the city, but it felt different this time. The city wasn't a place of painful memories anymore. It was a resource, a place where I could arm myself for the battle to come. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed a professional, someone who understood the world of wealth and contracts, a world that was completely alien to me. I found a law firm in the tallest, most intimidating building downtown. I walked in, my heart pounding, but my shoulders were back and my head was held high. I asked for the best lawyer they had, who specialized in estates and high-value assets. I was shown into the office of a woman named Patricia Wells. She was sharp, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She didn't look at me with pity, the way everyone else had since Robert died. She looked at me like a client, a person with a problem to be solved. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk, and for the first time, I told the whole story to a stranger. I told her about Robert, about Marcus, about the will. I told her about the car in Robert's journal. I told her about James Harrison. As I spoke, I watched her expression change. It went from professional interest to sharp focus, and then to a look of profound, calculated respect. She didn't interrupt me once. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair and was silent for a full minute. Her fingers steepled under her chin. Then she leaned forward. She told me that what I had was more than just a valuable asset. It was leverage, the most powerful kind of leverage there is. Over the next few hours, Patricia and I laid out a plan. It wasn't just a legal strategy. It was a battle plan. She made calls, her voice crisp and authoritative. She confirmed the ownership of the car was solely mine, free and clear. As part of the ranch's contents, she had a private investigator do a discreet background check on my son's project, confirming that his entire financial future was riding on securing an investment from one man, and one man only, James Harrison. With every piece of information Patricia gathered, I felt stronger, more in control. The timid, heartbroken woman who had fled the city a week ago was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, a woman who was calm, deliberate, and cold. I was no longer reacting to what my son had done to me. I was actively planning my response. We researched Mr. Harrison, learning about his habits, his passions, his past investments. We prepared documents. We rehearsed conversations. By the time I left Patricia's office late that afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. But I wasn't afraid of the shadows anymore. I understood them. Patricia had given me more than just legal advice. She had given me a new vocabulary, the language of power. I drove back to the ranch, not as an exile, but as a general returning to her command post. The barn was no longer a dusty sanctuary of memories. It was an armory, and inside it, polished and waiting, was a $3 million weapon. I was ready. While I was fortifying my position at the ranch, my son Marcus was living in a different world entirely. A world of gleaming glass and cool, polished concrete. 40 stories above the city streets, he stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment, looking down at the sprawling grid of lights below. In his reflection, he saw not just a man in an impeccably tailored suit. He saw the future. He saw the man he had always been destined to become, free from the grease and grime of his past. Tonight was the night before his meeting with Mr. Harrison. It was the eve of his coronation. He rehearsed his pitch, his voice smooth and confident, as it echoed in the minimalist space. He spoke of profit margins, of market demographics, of exclusive luxury experiences. The words flowed easily, a language he was fluent in. Unlike the humble, working-class dialect of his father, he felt a surge of satisfaction, thinking of how far he had come. He thought of me, his mother, safely tucked away at the ranch. The problem had been handled. She was out of sight, out of mind, surrounded by the sentimental junk she and his father had clung to for so long. He imagined her sitting in that dusty old house and felt not a shred of guilt, only relief. He had successfully firewalled his past from his future. His father's memory was a ghost he had finally exorcised, and his mother was a loose end he had neatly tied up and discarded. Later, he poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, the amber liquid, catching the light of the city. He made a call to a colleague, his voice brimming with a cocky self-assurance. He laughed as he recounted how he had finally settled his family affairs, describing the ranch as a sentimental dumping ground. He told his friend that you have to be willing to cut away the dead weight if you want to fly. He said, some people are just born to be background characters in someone else's more important story. He was completely at ease, basking in the glow of his own imminent success. He had no doubt that Mr. Harrison would be captivated by his vision, by his ambition, by the sheer force of his will. He was on the verge of securing the deal that would make him a legend, a player in the world that truly mattered. He looked at his reflection one last time before bed, raising his glass in a silent toast to the man in the mirror. He was so busy admiring the skyscraper he had built himself up to be, he never once thought to check the foundation. He had no idea that 100 miles away, in a dusty barn he so thoroughly despised, a single crack was about to bring the whole structure crashing down. The restaurant was a hushed temple of wealth, a place where deals were made in quiet tones over plates of food that cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to. But I wasn't intimidated. I walked in, my lawyer Patricia by my side, feeling a calm I hadn't known in years. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, and around my neck was the string of pearls Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary. My armor. We were shown to a discreet table with a clear view of the restaurant's entrance, just as Patricia had arranged. We ordered coffee and we waited. 15 minutes later, they arrived. My son, Marcus, looked sleek and predatory in his expensive suit, his face a mask of confident ambition. The man with him, however, was the one who held my attention. Mr. Harrison was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. They were seated at a prominent table in the center of the room. The show was about to begin. I watched as Marcus launched into his presentation. His hands moved with practiced enthusiasm as he pointed to charts and blueprints on a tablet. He was selling his vision, selling his future. Mr. Harrison listened politely, his expression unreadable, occasionally nodding but offering little encouragement. From our table, I could feel Marcus's nervous energy, the desperate need for approval radiating from him. The meeting seemed to be winding down. Mr. Harrison pushed his chair back slightly, a clear signal that the conversation was over. This was our cue. Patricia and I stood up and began to walk toward their table. Marcus saw me first. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in a flash of pure fury. "Mother," he hissed, his voice a low, angry buzz. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." He looked like a cornered animal. But Mr. Harrison wasn't looking at Marcus. His eyes were fixed on me, specifically on the pearls around my neck. He ignored my son completely, stood up from his chair, and took a step toward me. His eyes, which had been cool and distant, were now filled with a warm flicker of recognition. "You must be Eleanor," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Robert showed me a picture of you wearing those pearls once. He told me they were his proudest purchase." I smiled, a real smile, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "It's an honor to finally meet you. Mr. Harrison, my husband spoke of you often." Marcus was frozen, his mouth slightly open, a look of utter confusion on his face. Mr. Harrison's gaze finally turned to my son, and the warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look as cold and hard as steel. He said, "Young man, you spent the last hour trying to sell me on a soulless resort made of glass and concrete. You want me to invest millions in your ambition, but you were ashamed of the man who gave you your name. You dismissed your father's life's work, a masterpiece of engineering and passion, as a pile of junk. You, sir, do not understand the first thing about true value." Then he turned back to me, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly. "Eleanor, Robert and I had a gentleman's agreement. The price for the Shelby was $3 million. My offer still stands. I would be honored to write you a check this afternoon." Time seemed to stop. The blood drained from Marcus's face, leaving him pale and slack-jawed. The confident, ambitious man from a moment ago was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. He had been so focused on climbing to the top, he had never realized he was standing on the very treasure he was seeking, and had just kicked it away with his own 2 feet. 6 months passed. The silence at the ranch was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a comfortable blanket of my own choosing. The old farmhouse was transformed, restored not with flashy extravagance, but with the quiet elegance Robert would have appreciated. New windows let the morning light flood in. The floors no longer creaked with sorrow, and a modern kitchen stood where the old, tired one had been. But the heart of the ranch, the barn, remained largely untouched, a monument to the man who had built it. The Shelby Cobra was gone, but I hadn't sold it. I couldn't bring myself to part with Robert's final masterpiece. Instead, I had loaned it to the National Automotive Museum. It sat on a rotating platform under soft, warm lights, a sapphire jewel for the whole world to see. Patricia had helped me draft the inscription for the small brass plaque in front of it. It did not mention a monetary value. It simply read, "The 1966 Shelby Cobra 427, lovingly restored over 20 years by Robert Morrison, a master mechanic and a man of vision." His name, his true identity, was honored in a way that could never be erased. The money from Mr. Harrison sat in a trust managed by Patricia. I used a portion of it, a significant portion, to establish a foundation, not a scholarship fund for ambitious students, but a relief fund for working mechanics and tradesmen who fell on hard times. A fund that could help a man like my Robert, a man who worked with his hands, keep his dignity when life got tough. It was a legacy built from honor, a direct response to a son who was poisoned by shame. Then, one crisp autumn evening, the phone rang. It was Marcus. I almost didn't recognize the voice. The arrogant, confident tone was gone, replaced by a ragged, broken sound. He was crying. He told me the resort project had collapsed. His reputation was ruined. He had lost everything. He begged me to help him, his words a desperate, tumbling plea. He said he was sorry, that he had made a terrible mistake. He asked me to save him. I listened to it all without interruption, my hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of an old wrench I had kept from Robert's workbench. When he was finished, a long silence stretched between us. I did not offer him comfort. I did not offer him money. I let him sit in the wreckage he had created. I told him in a calm, steady voice that he had chosen his path the day he stood in that lawyer's office. He had chosen to discard his father's legacy and his mother's love. Now, he had to learn to walk on the path he had chosen for himself. He sobbed that he wanted my forgiveness. I told him my forgiveness was not his to earn. If he truly wanted to begin to make amends, he could start by apologizing to the man whose memory he had so eagerly tried to bury. I told him to go to Robert's grave, to stand there and say the words of respect and love he had been too arrogant and too ashamed to say when his father was alive. I told him maybe then he could begin to forgive himself. Then, before he could plead any more, I quietly ended the call. I stood up and walked out onto the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. I held Robert's old wrench in my hand, the cold, heavy steel, a familiar comfort. Its value wasn't in dollars. Its value was in the work it had done, the things it had built. My son thought legacy was something you bought. I now knew it was something you build with your hands and with your heart. The transformation was complete. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own peace, anchored by the quiet dignity of a good man's love. Thank you for joining me on Eleanor's journey. Her story makes you think about what forgiveness and accountability really mean. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If you were in her shoes, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have chosen a different path for Marcus? Let me know in the comments below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of strength and justice, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. It truly helps, and it ensures you'll be the first to know when a new story arrives.